Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mason Okamura.
I'm Walker Betzer.
I'm Aaron Percheckley.
I'm Jack McCord.
Today, we're going to be talking about a gray area in American politics and world culture, and that is marijuana. We're going to be talking about its implications, if it's legal, and most importantly, whether it applies to workers' compensation and if it's covered.
So I'm going to be talking about how marijuana is metabolized. So THC enters the bloodstream through the lungs, and then peak effects of marijuana is achieved after 6 to 10 minutes, and then marijuana and THC is stored in the blood in fat cells, which is why marijuana is detectable for a long period after use. So employees, when taking a drug test, there's multiple ways for marijuana to be detected in somebody's system. So these are a few ways that drug test could find marijuana in somebody's system, and marijuana lasts in urine tests for up to 30 days, hair for up to 90 days, sweat for up to 7 to 14 days, blood for up to 12 hours, and your breath for up to 3 hours. So these are some facts about employers and conducting drug tests. So 56% of employers do conduct drug tests, 48% of employers do not test for cannabis, and 44% of employers that do test for cannabis run into recruiting issues and retention issues. This next slide is showing where marijuana is legalized and where it's not legalized, and is showing that there's no national precedent, and it depends on which state you're in of whether marijuana is legalized. So when talking about workers' compensation and whether it would be covered, you have to go based on the state laws, not a national precedent.
So, as you can see, we already know this, but marijuana is not legal in Georgia. It's very illegal. So, according to the American Academy of Actuaries case study, we concluded that injured parties being under the influence of marijuana can determine certain outcomes and whether or not it is or isn't covered by workers' compensation. In America, there are only a few states that allow workers' comp to cover medical marijuana, and a lot of this is due to marijuana not being FDA regulated. So we figured out in the end that it is very difficult to get actual coverage on medical marijuana.
So now we're going to look at two cases in the United States that discuss the differences in reimbursement for medical marijuana between states. For this particular case, Minnesota declined a workers' comp coverage case regarding medical marijuana. It shows that some states are not going to approve of medical marijuana because of the Federal Controlled Substance Act, meaning that people cannot get reimbursed for medical marijuana whether they're prescribed or not prescribed. For this case specifically, the state of New Jersey actually does allow the reimbursement of medical marijuana through workers' comp. The federal government does not preempt state medical marijuana law. Employers are actually encouraged to use workers' comp to cover marijuana, and the state order of reimbursement eliminates the federal charges that could come along with it. This difference between the two cases emphasizes the difference in the laws between states for reimbursement of medical marijuana regarding workers' comp coverage.
In this case, there was an employee in Florida who was injured during the job, and she failed a drug test afterwards, and her employer refused to cover her for workers' compensation. So she decided to fight the case, trying to say that it wasn't fair that she was tested for having marijuana in her system after being injured. But she fought on a level of fairness rather than trying to prove that it was due to the employer or some sort of negligence, or that she was sober during work, which led to her still losing the case and not getting any coverage. So in the case of how courts would rule when determining if after having marijuana in your system, if you should get workers' compensation coverage or not, if you are required to take a drug test, it's best to just stay away from marijuana so you don't have it in your system at all. And if you get injured and fail a drug test, then rather than trying to prove that it wasn't fair, it's best to show negligence on the employer, that you were sober during work, or that if you were, whether or not you were impaired or not, you still would have been injured the exact same way. If there's no drug test at all, it's just best to not be impaired while you're working. And if you do happen to fail a drug test after you're injured and you were sober during the injury, if you really, there might be a possibility of taking another drug test after, let's say, 27 days, and that'll prove that you were sober during work if you passed that test. So when determining if an insurer can use marijuana as a workers' compensation benefit, since there's no federal precedent set yet on the use of marijuana or medical marijuana, it's very important to go look towards the states and what they've determined in the past for their state precedent. And like Jack said before, some states that are, may cover medical marijuana usage, but others may not. So if it's illegal in the state, it's just not going to be covered at all because, of course, it's illegal. And even some states that are where marijuana and medical marijuana is fully legalized, they still may not cover it for workers' compensation due to federal laws and regulations.
Now, when examining the statistical difference of the loss history between impaired and not impaired employees, there are a couple variations between those who test positive and those who do not. For those who recreationally use marijuana while in the workplace and are between the ages of 20 to 34, there is a 10% increase in workplace injuries. Now, on the other hand, those aged between 25 and 44 see a 19.5% reduction in fatalities during the workplace while recreationally using marijuana. Some of these other important statistics to keep in mind, however, are employees who test positive for marijuana in the workplace experience 55% more industrial accidents. These same employees had 85% more injuries during the workplace while impaired, and employees who tested positive for marijuana in the workplace had 75% greater absenteeism. So there are definitely statistics that you can look at that vary the cause and effect of use of marijuana in the workplace.
So, from our presentation today, we learned that marijuana is a very ambiguous case. Some of the main points are workers' compensation in relation to marijuana really differs from state to state. It's not established on a federal level, so it really switches. In terms of the leniency, some states are more strict, some states are less strict, and it really depends on their state government. And in the case that there is an incident, one of the biggest factors is sobriety. Some states have coverage for medical marijuana treatments, and there should be evidence for sobriety or lack of negligence for the claims to be covered regarding injury. And finally, one of the most important parts of determining if it is covered is previous precedents. As we know in our government, every court system is ruled now by precedents. What happened before, what's happened in the past, that's entirely what a state government will rule its cases on, and in the case of marijuana, it stays the same. So, in conclusion, Mr. and Mrs. Broker, as underwriters, we chose to go in this career because we want the right to say yes or no. You have to say yes. We're saying no. We're not writing your policy. Thank you for your time.